As the American government has become more intrusive, violating the rights of its citizens with police tactics that would have been unthinkable a few decades ago, the right to resist unjust laws has become a live issue for many Americans, especially militia groups and other so-called patriot organizations. What position should libertarians take on this controversy? Some of us who reject violence do not wish to identify ourselves with extreme right-wingers, but this should not prevent us from frankly discussing the right to resist unjust laws and ultimately the right of revolution against tyrannical governments. These two rights, that of resistance and that of revolution, have played a crucial role throughout the history of libertarian thought, especially during the 17th and 18th centuries, when they were inseparably linked to the theories of natural rights, social contract, and government by consent, those basic principles on which modern libertarian theory is based. Some libertarians may dismiss this inquiry as of merely historical interest, an antiquarian exercise with no relevance to the modern movement. Surely, I am not calling for armed resistance against the American government. No, I am not. But the fact that I do not personally favor armed resistance does not answer the question of whether there exists a legitimate right to resist, as judged by our common libertarian principles. It is always important to distinguish a right from the exercise or implementation of that right. A right creates a legitimate moral option, but it does not require that we choose that option. I have the right to purchase a car or the right to attend a conference, but I am not morally obligated to do either. Likewise, the right of resistance means that one has the moral option to use violence in self-defense against government, but it does not mean that one is somehow required to do so. It is my personal belief that the right to use violence to resist the enforcement of unjust laws, though morally justifiable, is normally unwise and imprudent. But I recognize that other people may choose to exercise their legitimate rights in a broader range of cases. I maintain that all libertarians should support these efforts so long as they constitute legitimate self-defense, whatever we may personally think of the people involved and however we may personally feel about violence. To repeat, we must always distinguish the defense of a right, which is a question of ethics, from our personal judgment as to whether we should exercise that right in a particular case, which is a question of prudence. Modern libertarian theory is steeped in the revolutionary ideology of the 17th and 18th centuries. Of this, there can be no doubt. It was from English writers such as Algernon Sidney, who wrote Discourses Concerning Government, John Locke, who wrote 2 treatises of government, and Trenchard and Gordon, the authors of Cato's Letters, that 18th century Americans learned their revolutionary catechism. Thomas Jefferson, for example, adopted as his family motto the statement from Sidney, "Resistance to tyrants is obedience unto God." Libertarians are generally aware of their revolutionary heritage. What they sometimes fail to appreciate, however, is how detailed and specific our forefathers were about the rights of resistance and revolution. They considered these subjects in far greater detail than have present-day libertarians, but many of their insights have unfortunately been ignored or lost by the modern movement. A major purpose of my presentation this morning is to revisit some of their ideas. Having immersed myself for many years in the revolutionary literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, I sometimes forget that my enthusiasm is not shared by every libertarian. I am still quite astonished when I recall that some dedicated libertarians have never even read John Locke, even though his second treatise of government is arguably the most important and influential book on liberty ever written. Since I shall refer to this literature frequently throughout the talk, perhaps I should explain why I think other libertarians should also take it seriously. I recommend that you read such people, not because they will increase your knowledge of history, though there is certainly nothing wrong with that, but because they will increase your knowledge of freedom. Much of what they have to say is of practical value to modern libertarians. We must remember that our forefathers faced even greater odds than we do, yet their efforts to establish liberty in various spheres, religious, political, personal, and economic, proved far more successful than has the modern movement. The theory of rights and limited government was developed during the 17th century. The 18th century implemented a liberty that was based on this theory. The 19th century, by and large, enjoyed that liberty. The 20th century destroyed it. If we want to know how to convert people to our ideas and establish a free society, we should begin by reading our successful ancestors. Their ideas are as fresh and suggestive as the day they were written, however old and dusty the books may be in which those ideas appear. Philosophy, unlike physical science, does not tend to advance through the progressive accumulation of knowledge. The modern student of physics does not need to read Isaac Newton in order to learn about physics. The student, if he reads Newton at all, does so because he is interested in the origin and history of his science, not because he expects to find the best presentation of his subject matter. What remains of value in Newton has been sifted and refined by many generations of scientists, and the student can benefit from this cumulative process by reading a modern, up-to-date text on physics. But philosophical theories, including ideas about liberty, do not follow this cumulative pattern. They tend to zig forward and zag backward in an erratic and unpredictable fashion. The theory of liberty, as I indicated previously, began to zig noticeably in the 17th century. This trend continued, more or less, until the 20th century brought us statism, collectivism, and total war. This highly retrogressive zag, which is probably the most severe setback that liberty has ever suffered, continued virtually unchecked until the rebirth of libertarian theory just a few decades ago. Let me try to clarify the historical status of the modern movement through an analogy. The Italian Renaissance of the 15th century, which was an enthusiastic revival of Greek philosophy, science, and literature, paved the way for the scientific revolution. The European mind was stimulated to move forward by looking backward at the finest intellectual culture ever produced in the Western world, that of ancient Greece. As libertarians, we look forward to a revolution in liberty, but this lies somewhere in the future. We are currently in our Renaissance stage, attempting to restore the lost or forgotten ideas of our predecessors. The intellectual culture of the 17th and 18th centuries, a period rich in libertarian ideas, is to our modern Renaissance what the culture of ancient Greece was to the Italian Renaissance, the source of our inspiration and the foundation of our future progress. I suggest that libertarians can best move forward by first looking backward and rediscovering the intellectual gems that were bequeathed to us by our libertarian forefathers, who were far more advanced than we are in several major areas. One such area is the theory of resistance and revolution. Before proceeding, I should dispose of a myth that is believed by many Americans, including some libertarians. This is the belief that the rights of resistance and revolution were meant to apply only to monarchies, oligarchies, and other non-democratic forms of government. This is manifestly false. These rights were applicable to any form of government that had degenerated into despotism or tyranny. As John Locke said in his second treatise of government, it is a mistake to think that only monarchies can become tyrannical. Other forms of government are equally susceptible to this danger. Quoting Locke, "Wherever the power that is put into any hands for the government of the people and the preservation of their properties is applied to other ends and made use of to impoverish, harass, or subdue them to the arbitrary, irregular commands of those that have it, there it presently becomes tyranny, whether those that thus use it are one or many." Likewise, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, referring to the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, states, "Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it." Our forefathers were keenly aware of the fact that any form of government, including democracy, can easily degenerate into tyranny. They drew a crucial distinction between the principle of government and the form of government. Principle refers to the basic purpose or function of government, or what it is supposed to accomplish. Form refers to the structure or type of government, such as monarchy or democracy. The original principle of the American government, according to its founders, was the protection of individual rights, especially those to life, liberty, and property. The intended form of the American government was republican, a type of limited democracy wherein majority rule is restricted by the constitutionally protected rights of the minority. America's founders repeatedly argued that form should always be subordinated to principle. In other words, that democracy is justified only so long as it preserves freedom. Many expressed their concern that later generations of Americans would forget this all-important distinction and mistake the form of government for its principle. They would defend democracy as an end in itself, even if it systematically violated the rights of its citizens, and thus would begin the slippery slide of America into democratic despotism, a theme that was widely discussed throughout the 18th century. Some Americans, such as John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, were highly skeptical of democracy and its ability to maintain individual rights, while others, such as Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, were more optimistic. But even Jefferson shared the common belief of his day that the American Republic would eventually degenerate and succumb to tyranny. Indeed, Jefferson predicted that Americans would probably lose their liberty within 200 to 300 years, which of course is the period of time in which we are now living. This descent into tyranny was regarded as virtually inevitable, as Americans lost sight of the principles on which their country was founded, and as they became inattentive and indifferent to the accumulation and abuse of governmental power. And when tyranny becomes firmly established, the only way to defeat it is through another revolution. Now, this sounds like a prescription for violence, until we recall that during the 18th century, the term revolution did not necessarily carry this implication. A revolution could be, and ideally should be, nonviolent. Indeed, it was not uncommon to distinguish the American Revolution per se from the War for Independence. In a famous letter to Jefferson, an elderly John Adams asked, "What do we mean by the Revolution? The war? That was no part of the Revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it." According to Adams, the real revolution took place in the minds of the American people, and this was effected between 1763 and 1775 before a drop of blood was drawn at Lexington. This analysis, with which Jefferson heartily agreed, was more than the pontificating of two aging icons. It was grounded in the ideology of radical republicanism. The word revolution, which political philosophers borrowed from astronomy, denoted the circular movement of something that revolves and returns to its original starting point. In politics, this meant a return to the fundamental principles of individual rights, social contract, and government by consent. In other words, a mental or intellectual revolution.